According to various sources, in the post-war Soviet Union, between 200 and 500,000 criminal cases were initiated on charges of collaborationism. More than 11,000 of the accused were sentenced to the ultimate penalty, execution by firing squad. The events unfolded in Kyiv as the 1950s of the 20th century drew to a close. Outside the windows of the majestic Lenin Palace of Culture, a gentle May twilight was already blanketing the city streets. In its brightly lit hall, a gala reception hosted by the Kyiv District Party Committee was underway. A peculiar atmosphere filled the room, one where festive elation curiously mingled with notes of bright sorrow for the past. The light jingle of orders and medals on the suit jackets and tunics of the great patriotic war veterans created a unique melody, a melody of courage and stoically borne hardships. Among the invited guests was Maria Semyonovna Kolesnichenko, a simple primary school teacher, her hair already touched by a noble gray. She had received the invitation to this celebration as a community activist who had dedicated many years to instilling a deep sense of patriotism in children. With a somewhat detached smile, the woman listened to the booming toasts and frontline stories echoing from all sides. Suddenly, her attention was captured by a man of about 50, standing in a circle of animatedly chatting comrades. He was a tall, sturdily built man with a strong-willed face, now slightly heavy with time, who was laughing loudly. His chest was a veritable iconostasis of awards, among which the Order of the Red Banner was particularly conspicuous. Maria Semyonovna's gaze slid past the gleaming awards on the veteran's chest. It wasn't the regalia that had caught her eye. Her heart stopped for a moment, then began to race, pounding wildly as if trying to break free. The air caught in her throat, preventing her from breathing. The entire world around her ceased to exist, dissolving into the features of a single face. The very same face that had relentlessly haunted her nightmares for 15 long years. Memory obligingly transported her to the raw, damp autumn of 1943, to the Ukrainian village of Zelenaya, nestled near Zhytomyr. Back then, as a 14-year-old girl named Marusha, she had endured the unthinkable. Everything was imprinted in her mind with frightening photographic clarity. The chaos of sounds and smells, the hysterical screams of people, the vicious barking of dogs, the dry crackle of machine gun fire, and the acrid stench that mixed gunpowder with the smoke of burning hay. And in the midst of it all was him. He stood apart from the punitive detachment, clad in a flawless leather coat, his cap habitually pushed to the back of his head. He was distinguished by an icy calm, not a single superfluous movement, not one loud word. He merely hissed short, clipped commands through his teeth in mangled Russian, his German accent harsh and grating. It was his impassive finger that had pointed toward their cottage. It was he who had watched with dispassionate curiosity as her father and mother were dragged into the courtyard and pressed against the wooden wall of the barn. And then the command rang out, and the girl's familiar world shattered into fragments. A mother's instinct had worked flawlessly. A moment before the volley, she shoved her daughter to the ground, and the girl collapsed beneath the limp, lifeless bodies of her parents. The sounds of death rattles reached her, fading groans, and then the receding stomp of boots and scraps of foreign speech. She lay there, daring not to move, holding her breath, feeling the warm blood of her family soak through her dress and trickle into the cold autumn mud. The image of that Punisher in the leather coat, with his lifeless, cold, fish-like eyes, was forever seared into her childhood memory. There was no doubt. It was him. Here, in peaceful Kyiv, surrounded by genuine heroes, in a hall celebrating heroes. A bottle of lemonade slipped from Maria Semyonovna's suddenly weak hands and shattered on the floor with a crystalline crash. The noise attracted the attention of several guests, causing them to turn. Someone solicitously inquired about Maria Semyonovna's well-being, but she seemed deafened. She didn't hear the words. Her gaze was fixed, riveted on the veteran. He, in turn, noticing the commotion at the table, turned his gaze in her direction. For one brief moment, their eyes met. A barely perceptible flicker of recognition flashed in his gaze, or perhaps it was only her imagination. The man immediately averted his eyes and tried to return to the interrupted conversation. However, the cheerfulness in his voice instantly vanished. Seized by a nervous tremor, Maria Semyonovna managed to stammer out a vague explanation for her state. No, it's fine. It just suddenly became hard to breathe in here. She began to slowly make her way to the exit, trying not to draw extra attention. A single deafening thought hammered in her mind. It's him. I have to report this. I simply must. The very next day, having gathered the last of her courage, Maria Semyonovna Kolesnichenko sat in an office of the Kyiv Directorate of the Ministry of State Security. Her story, jumbled and halting, full of tears and barely suppressed tremors, was heard attentively by a young investigator, Captain Ivanov. He did not interrupt. However, polite yet distinct skepticism was visible in his eyes. How many similar stories had he been forced to listen to in the post-war years? How many false denunciations had been made? How many fatal mistakes committed? How many personal scores settled by proxy? Are you certain, Citizen Kolesnichenko? The captain inquired delicately. After all, so much time has passed. A person's appearance can undergo significant changes. I am absolutely certain, Comrade Captain, Maria Semyonovna said with unshakable resolve, fixing him with a direct and honest gaze. You never forget a face like that. The wheels of the investigation, once set in motion, immediately hit an unforeseen obstacle. The difficulty lay in the identity of the man Kolesnichenko had pointed out. He turned out to be Pyotr Vasilievich Sidorenko. According to official records, he was the model of a Soviet hero, his biography flawless. A frontline soldier who had fought from the first day of the war to the last, a courageous commander of a reconnaissance company, his chest adorned with numerous awards. In the post-war years, his authority had only grown. A party member, an active community figure, he commanded indisputable respect in his district. Sidorenko's personal file contained not a single dark spot. The documents recorded his Smolensk origin and the tragic information about the death of his entire family during the occupation, which was the stated reason for his move to Kyiv, where he had started a new life. For Captain Ivanov, the situation had become a severe professional dilemma. On one side of the scale was the testimony of a schoolteacher, a woman whose mental state was clearly fractured by the horrors of war she had endured. On the other was the ironclad reputation and official papers of a decorated veteran whose heroism was beyond question. Any misstep in this case threatened to end the investigator's career, and possibly cost him his freedom. However, something in Maria Semyonovna's gaze, in the fire that burned in her eyes and in her indestructible conviction, prevented him from simply archiving the case. The captain decided to continue the investigation and get to the truth, no matter the cost. All this time, Maria Semyonovna lived in a state of extreme nervous tension. She was possessed by fear. She dreaded the authorities' disbelief, and simultaneously was paralyzed by the thought that the one she considered a monster would learn of her report and begin to retaliate. The woman was forced to change her daily routine, avoiding familiar roads and flinching at any sudden noise. But she banished any thought of retreat. The memories of her murdered parents and the dozens of other innocent victims from her native Zelenaya gave her no peace, searing her soul and demanding justice. The investigative team began their work by checking the most obvious facts. Official inquiries were sent to various archives and military commissariats in Sidorenko's alleged place of birth. The initial results, however, were disappointing, giving the investigation no leads. All the documents received fully corresponded to the biography the suspect himself presented. It seemed Maria Semyonovna's suspicions were baseless. But Captain Ivanov, known for his meticulousness and attention to detail, latched onto one significant inconsistency. While studying Sidorenko's file, he discovered a complete absence of any mention of his fellow soldiers from the reconnaissance company he claimed to have commanded. The documents contained only dry general formulations about the unit's combat path. This was extremely suspicious, as frontline soldiers who had passed through the crucible of war usually stuck together tightly and maintained contact for decades. Faced with this, Captain Ivanov adopted a completely different approach. He initiated a massive effort to find all residents of the village of Zelenaya, Zhytomyr region, who had managed to evacuate or survive the years of occupation. The task seemed exceedingly laborious. In the intervening years, people had scattered across the vast country. Many had changed their names and their traces were lost. However, persistence and tenacity bore fruit. Eventually, on a collective farm near Poltava, they managed to locate a witness, an elderly woman named Stepanida Kuzminichna, who turned out to be one of the few survivors of that terrible tragedy. Having sustained severe wounds during the massacre, she had been left for dead by the executioners. Upon her arrival in Kyiv, Stepanida Kuzminichna, her strength sapped by age and trauma, moved with noticeable effort, relying on a simple cane for support. The scene of her reunion with Maria Semyonovna was poignant and heartbreaking. The two women, their fates forever bound by a shared catastrophe, were once again overwhelmed by memories of that terrible day, dissolving into tears. Soon, a law enforcement officer presented her with a photograph of Pyotr Sidorenko, secretly taken by a camera lens at one of the formal gatherings. The elderly woman's first reaction was a barely audible whisper of recognition. "It's him." But almost immediately a shadow of doubt crossed her face, and she added uncertainly, "No, it doesn't look like him." But something in the man's eyes in the photograph caught her attention, forcing her to look again. She studied the picture long and hard, then asked the investigator to show her a close-up of one part of the image. It became obvious to the officer leading the case that the witness was wavering, and the burden of her years might have distorted her memory. Parallel to this interrogation, the investigative team focusing on Sidorenko himself stumbled upon another questionable circumstance. According to the official papers, he had earned his high honor, the Order of the Red Banner, for a valiant raid behind enemy lines in the autumn of 1943. This award coincided almost exactly with the time of the tragic events in Zelenaya. However, the description of the heroic deed itself in the award documents was surprisingly vague, filled only with general phrases lacking any specifics. The investigation decided to organize an informal identification, a sort of secret lineup. Maria Semyonovna and Stepanida Kuzminichna were to play the role of random passers-by in the park where Sidorenko habitually took his evening stroll. The plan was fraught with significant risk, but lacking any other solid evidence, it seemed the only chance. A cool evening descended on the city. Sidorenko walked leisurely down the alley, nonchalantly whistling a simple tune. At the sight of his figure, Maria Semyonovna tensed. She was seized by an internal pressure. Her hand instinctively and painfully gripped the elbow of the investigator accompanying her, who was posing as an ordinary stroller. At that same instant, Stepanida Kuzminichna, seated on a nearby bench, let out a stifled cry and clutched her heart. "It's him, without a doubt. It's just that time has left its mark on him. And look how many medals he's managed to pin on himself." Her words, full of bitterness and recognition, escalated into a piercing scream. Hearing this, Sidorenko spun around on the spot. For one brief moment, his face was distorted by an involuntary grimace, in which one could clearly read both astonishment and barely suppressed horror. He had unmistakably recognized both women. This momentary confusion passed almost instantly. Regaining his composure, he pulled the mask of complete calm back over his face and, quickening his pace, hurried away. This episode in the park became the turning point in the investigation. The authorities now had the testimony of two eyewitnesses. However, testimonies alone were not enough to charge a man with an impeccable reputation and numerous merits. They needed irrefutable, ironclad facts, and fate delivered them in the most unexpected way. The source of the evidence was discovered where no one had thought to look: in the Central State Archive of Film, Photo, and Phono Documents of the USSR. During the process of cataloging captured German film reels, one of the employees' attention was drawn to a series of photographs taken by a Wehrmacht war correspondent in the autumn of 1943 in the Zhytomyr region. Several frames documented a punitive operation carried out to intimidate the local population in a Ukrainian village. And in the group of punishers standing right next to the German officers, the camera lens had snatched the figure of a young man dressed in civilian clothes but with the treacherous armband of a Polizei collaborator on his sleeve. He was gesturing animatedly, his pointing finger directing attention to a group of people whose fate was sealed. The features of his face in the photograph were exceptionally clear. When shown the photographs, Maria Semyonovna was overcome by a storm of heavy memories, and the woman broke down in tears. She identified the man in the pictures without the slightest hesitation. It was him, albeit younger and without his trademark coat. The witness's memory had even preserved his real name, which she had repeatedly heard from the German occupiers, who addressed him as none other than Herr Krauze. Thus, the chain of irrefutable evidence was complete. The investigation had definitively established the respected veteran Pyotr Vasilyevich Sidorenko was, in fact, the brutal executioner Kurt Krauze. This former Volksdeutscher had, during the war, willingly gone to serve the invaders, taking the post of assistant chief of the Gestapo in the village of Zelenaya. He became infamous for his inhuman cruelty, personally participating in interrogations, sophisticated torture, and mass executions. The blood of countless innocent people was on this executioner's conscience. But the investigation still had to answer the main question. How had the criminal managed to pull off such an audacious identity theft? The picture of this cynical crime was reconstructed. At the end of the war, as the Red Army's rapid advance left collaborators no chance of escape, Krause, realizing the inevitability of retribution, decided to cover his tracks. In the summer of 1944, not far from the front line, he stumbled upon a mortally wounded, unconscious Soviet officer, Captain Pyotr Sidorenko. The criminal did not render aid but coldly waited for the captain to die, after which he appropriated his documents, medals, and personal belongings. Thus, the monstrous metamorphosis occurred. The traitor and murderer Kurt Krause transformed into the war hero Pyotr Sidorenko. Taking advantage of the chaos and confusion of the first post-war years, he masterfully settled into his new role and even managed to join the party, shielding his dark past with another's glory and another's blood. The arrest of Sidorenko Krause was carried out discreetly, without attracting undue attention. The moment the charges were read and the compromising photographs were shown, his face changed noticeably, though he tried desperately to maintain an outward composure. Nevertheless, his self-control abandoned him the moment Maria Semyonovna Kolesnichenko crossed the threshold of the office. His gaze, fixed on the woman, was full of undisguised malice and animalistic fear. The noble mask of the hero, which he had worn for so many years, was ruthlessly torn away, exposing the hideous visage of a traitor. The trial of Kurt Krause, also known as Pyotr Sidorenko, caused a huge public outcry. The courtroom was filled to capacity. People came to see with their own eyes the man who, for 15 years, had skillfully hidden his true face as a bloody executioner behind the mask of a hero. The testimonies of Maria Semyonovna Kolesnichenko and Stepanida Kuzminichna became the backbone of the indictment. In their statements, the women spoke of the monstrous atrocities committed by the punishers in the village of Zelenaya, and how their relatives were mercilessly dealt with before their very eyes. Their stories, steeped in deep sorrow and pain, left not a single indifferent heart in the courtroom. The final word in the case came from the German photographs, which became irrefutable proof of guilt. The frames, shown to the court and the public, clearly captured a young Krause personally directing the brutal massacre of civilians. Subsequent forensic analysis fully confirmed both the authenticity of the photo materials and the identity of the accused depicted in them. To the very end, Krause resorted to trickery, trying to evade responsibility. He stubbornly denied his involvement in the atrocities, claiming memory lapses. But the charges against him were undeniable. One by one, evidence of his criminal activities was revealed: torture, mockery of the defenseless, involvement in mass executions. During the investigation, other witnesses were found who had survived the horror of his atrocities during the occupation of Zelenaya. Maria Semyonovna testified in the courtroom. Looking directly into the face of the man who had destroyed her life and robbed her of her childhood, she spoke with unshakable resolve, although her internal agitation was betrayed by a tremor in her voice. Her words became the voice not only of her personal tragedy, but of all those who could not live to see this day of reckoning. Those whose fates were cut short by machine gun fire in the tragic autumn of 1943. He just stood there and watched, Maria Semyonovna conveyed, her words hanging in the oppressive silence of the hall. Watched as they took the lives of my parents, my neighbors, of innocent children, right before my eyes. In his gaze, she said, there was not a shadow of human compassion, only icy indifference and undisguised enjoyment of his absolute power over the destinies of others. She had forever imprinted his face in her memory, and had lived all these years waiting for the moment when justice would be served. The verdict rang out, harsh, but as inevitable as justice itself. For treason against the homeland, for the blood of peaceful Soviet citizens, for aiding and abetting the Nazi-fascist occupiers, Kurt Adolfovich Krause, who for many years had carried the assumed name of Pyotr Vasilyevich Sidorenko, was sentenced to the highest measure of punishment: death by firing squad. At the moment the sentence was announced, the defendant slumped. His face took on an earthy, deathly pallor, The military orders he had boasted of so proudly instantly turned into soulless metal, pathetic props against the backdrop of his inhuman atrocities. The long-awaited retribution, for which the souls of his victims had waited for years, had finally come to pass. Maria Semyonovna Kolesnichenko left the courthouse with a sense of mission accomplished. The weight that had pressed on her heart for all these long years was finally lifted. She understood clearly that her murdered parents could not be resurrected, but the triumph of justice brought her a bitter comfort. The man who, for 15 whole years, had hidden behind the mask of a hero and deceived everyone around him, had received his deserved punishment. And she, an ordinary schoolteacher, had managed to prove to the world that human memory can overcome any lie, and that no crime against humanity will ever fade into oblivion unanswered. Beyond the courthouse walls, spring in Kyiv lived its usual peaceful life, full of light and hope. Yet for Maria Semyonovna, this very May of 1959 would forever be etched in her memory as the time when the terrible phantom from her past acquired its true, ugly face and received its just deserts. And now, in the peaceful rustle of the young leaves on Kreshchatyk Street, she heard something more. It seemed as though the souls of the innocents murdered in Zelenaya had finally found eternal peace.